how does a city built on rain and roses become the front line of a nation's internal war? On that October afternoon in Portland, Oregon, the air trembled with defiance. More than 40,000 people filled the city's heart, chanting, singing, waving banners that read, "No Kings." They came not to destroy, but to remind America of its promise that no man, not even the president, stands above the law. Helicopters circled overhead. Journalists streamed live as crowds spilled across bridges and avenues, turning downtown into a living pulse of protest. By midday, the rally felt almost like a festival. Families brought their children, musicians played beside food vendors, yet beneath the laughter lingered something sharper, a collective unease, a whisper that the government's patience had run out. Under President Donald Trump's new domestic security enforcement directive, federal presence in cities like Portland had intensified. ICE agents, National Guard patrols, and tactical units had been ordered to protect federal assets and restore order. The streets knew what that meant. Then came the first arrest. Around 2:00 p.m., witnesses saw a man of familiar face from past rallies dragged to the ground and taken into the ICE facility. No reason was given. The man was blind, relying on a white cane to move through the crowd. Hours later, when he was released without it, cheers erupted as an officer silently returned the cane. That single gesture, quiet, uneasy, almost symbolic, became the emotional fuse that lit the crowd. The chants grew louder, fiercer, echoing off the steel and glass towers along the Willamette River. By 3:00 p.m., the rally's rhythm had shifted. Protesters surrounded the ICE complex on South Bancroft Street, shouting, "Quit your job and no kings." Some danced in inflatable costumes. Others linked arms across the blue line painted on the asphalt, a thin symbolic border between the people and the state. But as federal agents formed ranks inside the gates, it became clear that this was no longer a rally. It was a test. To officials in Washington, Portland represented a dangerous precedent, a city unwilling to obey federal command. The Department of Homeland Security labeled it a zone of insurrection, and by evening, tactical reinforcements had already been dispatched from Seattle and Spokane. According to BBC and Reuters reports, the administration viewed such deployments as preemptive stability operations. To protesters, it was the federalization of fear. The images that followed stunned the nation. Clouds of tear gas, flash grenades igniting the street riot shields, advancing under the dim glow of streetlights. Yet in those images lay something larger, the struggle for the American soul. This was not just about one protest or one city. It was about the meaning of freedom in a country where dissent can now be met with force. Analysts from Defense News compared Portland's situation to hybrid suppression tactics used in Eastern Europe, a mix of psychological control, information warfare, and show-of-force policing. Meanwhile, commentators at The Guardian warned that America's line between democracy and dominance is dissolving in real time. In Tel Aviv, Iranian dissidents saw echoes of their own crackdowns. In Kyiv, Ukrainian citizens recognized the same clouds of gas that once filled Maidan Square. The parallels were haunting different nations, same methods. What unfolded in Portland was not merely a local disturbance. It was the global reflection of a world tightening its grip. From Beijing's surveillance state to Moscow's security cordons, governments everywhere were redrawing the boundary between order and obedience. And now the United States, long the symbol of liberty, was showing the same signs. When the first tear gas canisters hissed through the Oregon rain, protesters covered their faces and linked arms again. Their chants grew hoarse but unbroken, the blue line beneath their feet blurred beneath mud and smoke, yet its meaning deepened. It was no longer just paint, it was the threshold between fear and freedom. And as night fell over Portland, one question cut through the choking air. When a democracy begins to fear its own people, who is truly in control, the governed or those who govern them? It began with silence, a silence that burned hotter than any chant. The crowd froze as federal agents surrounded a single man on the sidewalk outside the ICE complex. Cameras turned phones lifted. "He's blind," someone shouted. The man's white cane clattered onto the pavement as he was pulled down, handcuffed, and carried toward the gates. There was no explanation, no charge, just the thud of boots and the metallic echo of the gate slamming shut. That image, a man stripped of both freedom and dignity, tore through social media like wildfire. Within minutes, live streams were viewed hundreds of thousands of times. Onlookers cried out, "Let him go." A group of protesters began to chant the same phrase that would define the night: "Who do you protect? Who do you serve?" When the man was released hours later, limping and confused, the atmosphere shifted from disbelief to rage. The officer who returned his cane said nothing, just placed it in his hands like an afterthought. That act, both small and profound, symbolized something larger than the protest itself. It embodied the growing chasm between the enforcers of law and those demanding justice. Across the country, the scene in Portland reverberated like an alarm bell. From Seattle to Atlanta, news anchors debated whether this was civil disobedience or state aggression. Reuters described the images as reminiscent of authoritarian crackdowns once condemned by the United States. Meanwhile, the Department of Homeland Security issued a brief statement defending the officers' actions as standard containment measures. But the phrase containment cut deep to many. It suggested the people themselves had become the threat. By late afternoon, the mood outside the ICE Center turned electric. Protesters in shark and dinosaur costumes danced defiantly while others formed human chains across the road. It was absurd and beautiful, a carnival of dissent. Yet behind the laughter, the hum of dread grew louder. Federal agents lined up in formation inside the gates. They were faceless beneath their helmets, silent behind tinted visors. The blue line on the asphalt marked the end of public space and the beginning of federal control. Then came the second confrontation. Around 3:45 p.m., officers stormed forward, firing pepper balls into the air. Screams replaced songs. People scattered, clutching their faces. One man held up his sign, "No Kings," and refused to move. He was tackled, dragged behind the barricade, and vanished from sight. For those watching live, that was the breaking point. The parallels to international crackdowns were impossible to ignore. Al Jazeera compared the footage to the protests in Iran earlier that year, where peaceful demonstrators were met with gas and batons under the guise of restoring order. DW analysts drew attention to similar crowd control patterns in Hong Kong, where state forces blended intimidation with fatigue, wearing protesters down until resistance collapsed. The tactics were different in uniform, but identical in intent. By the time the gas cleared, Portland had become a mirror, reflecting not just America's unrest, but the fragility of its moral authority abroad. How could Washington condemn repression overseas while deploying the same measures at home? Military experts from Jane's Defense Weekly noted the irony. The same technology designed for counterinsurgency abroad is now being turned inward. Drones, surveillance tools, non-lethal munitions used against citizens instead of enemies. Families watched from their windows as clouds of white smoke rolled over the streets. Children cried as their parents rinsed their eyes with bottled water. The chants returned rasping but unbroken. "No kings, who do you serve?" By evening, the protest no longer felt like a political statement. It felt like survival. And as dusk fell over, the Willamette, America's question hung heavy in the rain-soaked air. When justice becomes selective, how long before obedience replaces freedom? The blue line gleamed under the Portland rain, thin, bright, almost innocent. But that paint cutting across South Bancroft Street carried the weight of an entire nation. On one side stood the people, soaked, chanting unarmed. On the other, the state armored, silent, unyielding. Between them stretched that strip of blue, a fragile promise that freedom still had a boundary. At 4:30 p.m., the line was broken. Without warning, federal officers fired tear gas into the crowd. White smoke exploded into the drizzle, curling through banners that moments earlier had read "Democracy Lives Here." People screamed, coughed, fell to their knees. Volunteers rushed forward with bottles of saline, flushing eyes clouded with chemical mist. Yet amid the chaos, one truth became impossible to ignore. The United States government was using the tools of war on its own streets. BBC correspondents described the scene as a theater of confusion, the fog of law enforcement meeting the fury of the people. Local medics counted dozens of injuries. Reporters were shoved, live streamers targeted by pepper balls, and a handful of arrests marked as federal compliance detentions. The term was bureaucratic. The reality was brutal. Experts from Defense News pointed out that many of the agents on the ground were not traditional ICE officers, but tactical units trained for riot suppression overseas, the same models used in Iraq and Afghanistan for population control and perimeter denial. Their deployment in Portland wasn't an accident. It was a message dissent was now classified as a domestic threat. But Portland's blue line was more than just a street marking. It had become a metaphor for the fracture within the American identity itself. DW commentators compared it to the red line rhetoric in global conflicts, thresholds crossed that can never be uncrossed. Once the government normalizes force against citizens, where does the escalation end? Across the Atlantic, similar questions echoed in Kyiv and Tel Aviv. In Ukraine, police in Kharkiv had recently clashed with demonstrators protesting military corruption, their scenes eerily similar tear gas riot shields, smoke. In Israel, anti-government marches in Tel Aviv were dispersed with sound grenades, drawing condemnation from European observers. Even in Beijing, the state-run media exploited Portland's unrest, claiming it exposed Western hypocrisy on human rights. America's moral high ground, once its most powerful weapon, was slipping away, not because of foreign rivals, but because of the mirror held up by its own people. When a democracy begins to act like those it condemns, its authority abroad dissolves faster than any alliance can save it. By 5:30 p.m., the standoff hardened. The blue line was slick with rain and tear gas residue. Protesters stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces pale under streetlights, refusing to retreat. A DJ played soft music, a haunting contrast to the chaos. A few knelt praying. Others whispered names of the detained as if reciting a new kind of national litany. Reuters noted that the Portland protests were now being watched live by over 8 million viewers globally, a number rivaling primetime broadcasts. The world was no longer just an audience, it was a witness, and what it saw was an empire wrestling with its own image of control. By dusk, the line between protest and punishment had vanished. The chants echoed once more, tired but defiant. Who do you protect? Who do you serve? Then came the flash, another volley of gas, another cloud swallowing the crowd. The blue line disappeared completely under the gray film of smoke and rain. And as the night settled, one question lingered, whispered through cracked voices and streaming screens alike. When the state must gas its citizens to maintain order, has it already lost the very authority it seeks to protect? The rain began as a whisper, soft, almost cleansing. But in Portland that night, it didn't wash the streets clean. It carried the residue of tear gas, the metallic sting of pepper spray, and the faint echo of defiance. By 6:15 p.m., hundreds of soaked protesters still stood at the gates of the ICE facility, drenched but unbroken. The blue line that once divided them from the agents had turned into a river of mud and light glowing faintly beneath the downpour. What started as a rally had become something far greater, a standoff between conscience and command. The images beamed around the world told a story not of chaos, but of endurance. People dancing in the rain, a DJ spinning soft rhythms beneath storm clouds, medics wrapping wet bandages, strangers holding hands, murmuring prayers for peace. It was both tragic and beautiful, the kind of scene that defines a generation. On the rooftop of the ICE facility, federal agents had pitched tents to shield themselves from the rain. Their silhouettes flickered in the floodlights, watchful, unmoving alien. From below, the protesters shouted, "Welcome to Portland." You melt in a drizzle, laughter rippled through the crowd. For a fleeting moment, humanity pierced through the hostility. But the tension never left. The Guardian later described that moment as a fragile dance between courage and collapse. Experts interviewed by DW saw it differently, as a psychological standoff. When both sides stopped speaking and simply endure, one analyst wrote, "That's not peace. That's the eye of the storm." President Donald Trump, addressing reporters at the White House, praised the federal response, calling it a model for urban order. His administration claimed that radicalized agitators had infiltrated the protests, but local reporters from Reuters and BBC found no evidence of organized violence, only scattered confrontations provoked by advancing officers. The gulf between federal narrative and reality grew wider by the hour. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the story of Portland resonated with eerie familiarity. In Kyiv, Ukrainian students drew parallels between Portland's protesters and their own struggle against government overreach. In Tehran, Iranian state media mocked America's law and order hypocrisy, showing side-by-side clips of Portland and previous U.S. condemnations of Iranian crackdowns. In Hong Kong, activists shared footage from Portland with the caption, "Now you understand." What united them all was not ideology, but experience, the feeling of standing in the rain surrounded by power and realizing that truth itself had become a battlefield. Jane's Defense Weekly later revealed that the gas canisters used that night were part of a new compliance series developed for crowd management in conflict zones, small rapid deployment munitions designed to minimize casualties while maximizing psychological disorientation. But in Portland, they had another effect: solidarity. Every burst of gas drew more people back. Every order to disperse made the crowd grow. By 7:00 p.m., elderly residents arrived with umbrellas and flashlights. Some brought food, others brought music. "We'll stay," one man said, "until the rain stops or the truth does." His words spread online, becoming the night's unofficial slogan. When the next round of tear gas came at 7:30, it hit harder than before. The rain turned the gas into mist that clung to skin and clothing. Fires sparked in the wet grass, glowing like candles before being drowned by the storm. Yet even then, people didn't run. They covered one another with tarps, poured water into eyes, and kept chanting through cracked voices. The images drenched faces, trembling hands. A blue line lost beneath the storm spread across the world, stirring debates on whether America was still the model of freedom it claimed to be. Al Jazeera's anchor asked bluntly, if this is democracy defending itself, what does tyranny look like? And so beneath the rain and gas, the chants turned from anger to endurance, from no kings to something older, almost sacred. We are still here. Because when the storm ends, history never remembers who fired first, only who refused to disappear. But in a nation now defined by defiance, what happens when endurance itself becomes the only form of freedom left? By dawn, the smoke had thinned, but the damage was done. Portland had become the new front line of a national reckoning, not between citizens and police, but between two competing visions of America itself. One demanded obedience for safety, the other demanded liberty despite danger. The conflict was no longer about a single night or a single protest, it was about who defines order in the land of the free. President Donald Trump addressed the nation the following morning. His words were measured but unyielding. We will not allow chaos to consume our cities. America will have law and order, period. Behind him stood Homeland Security officials, ICE commanders, and senior defense aides. They framed the Portland operation as a triumph of strategic restraint, the containment of civil unrest with non-lethal precision. Yet to millions watching from home, the images told a different story. Stormtroopers in camouflage tear gas in the rain, and citizens choking in the streets of their own democracy. Reuters and The Guardian both noted that Portland was only the beginning. Similar enforcement deployments were already planned for Atlanta, Chicago, and Denver. Each was part of what Washington insiders called Operation Urban Sentinel, an initiative to federalize urban policing under the banner of counterterrorism. The White House described it as necessary coordination. Civil rights groups called it martial law by another name. The Pentagon, in statements leaked to Defense News, revealed that tactical gear and surveillance drones used in Portland were repurposed from border operations. Thermal imaging, facial recognition, and crowd monitoring software had turned the city into a testing ground for 21st century domestic control. Analysts warned that America's distinction between foreign and domestic threats was eroding fast, and once that barrier collapsed, it would never return. Across Europe, the reaction was sharp. DW reported that German lawmakers were deeply unsettled by the militarization of American policing, comparing it to anti-riot doctrines once seen in Cold War Berlin. In London, BBC analysts drew parallels to Northern Ireland's Operation Motorman in the 1970s, a campaign where excessive force produced not peace, but permanent mistrust. The world, it seemed, was watching America unlearn its own lessons. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, Iran's state broadcaster Arab used the footage as propaganda, claiming the US government gasses its own citizens. Moscow followed suit, calling the protest proof of Western decay. Beijing state media praised Washington's stability operations, thinly veiling its own endorsement of authoritarian control. What began as an American story had become a global spectacle, a test of the West's moral credibility. Military analysts at Jane's Defense Weekly issued a stark warning. When democracies use the same playbook as autocracies, they lose not only legitimacy, but strategic deterrence. You cannot export freedom with tear gas. The report argued that America's internal unrest would embolden its adversaries, particularly China and Russia, to exploit the narrative of hypocrisy. Indeed, Beijing's cyber propaganda networks were already flooding global media with clips of Portland's clashes juxtaposed with Trump's speeches about defending democracy in Taiwan and Ukraine. In Tehran, officials mocked Washington's human rights reports, calling them fiction written in smoke. And in Moscow, Kremlin strategists celebrated what they called the visual collapse of the American ideal. Inside the US, however, the debate was more visceral. Homeland Security officials insisted that the crackdown was necessary to preserve sovereignty. Civil rights leaders countered that sovereignty without freedom was simply control by another name. The clash mirrored the global divide nations, claiming security citizens demanding dignity. As one Al Jazeera commentator put it, Portland is not just a protest, it is America's confession. And in that confession lies a haunting truth. Every empire that forgets the meaning of its own laws eventually turns those laws against itself. Now the blue line once painted to mark the edge of order has blurred into a question that no leader can escape. How much force can a democracy use before it stops being one? When the rain finally stopped, the city of Portland looked like a battlefield. After the retreat, the scent of gas still clinging to the asphalt banners torn the blue line almost invisible beneath streaks of mud. Only the red and blue flashes of police lights remained, painting the wet pavement like fading embers of a long night. Yet in that silence, something profound lingered. The people had not won, but they had not surrendered either. By midnight, the last protesters had dispersed. Some limped home, others stayed behind to clean debris from the sidewalks. A few knelt at the gate, whispering the same question that had defined the night: who do you protect? Who do you serve? It wasn't just defiance, it was grief, exhaustion, and an aching recognition that America's identity now hung in the balance between two kinds of fear: the fear of losing control and the fear of losing freedom. Federal officials